So, I mean, I have a lecture, but and I can sort of say some stuff for a while. But I really would like this to be very interactive because you're old, mature grown-ups, right? And you don't want to like listen to people like me. You learn more by talking about stuff. So, I mean, I'll sort of lecture, but feel free to have questions or interjections. And then for sure, once that finishes, then we can just sort of have an open discussion. And I'm assuming, I mean, there were 4 or 5 chapters I asked people to look at from this Katzenstein-Checkel book. So what I'm saying assumes that you've read whatever those 4 or 5 chapters were. And so, yeah, I really am low tech. I don't use this stuff. I hate PowerPoint. PowerPoint, at least in North America, has destroyed the public speaking skills of an entire generation of younger students. They talk to the PC and the screen instead of to you, okay? And you may get sick of having me stare at you as opposed to the screen because I'm ugly, but I mean, I just watched this happen for years. Anyway, so yeah, I don't use that stuff. So this is just simply sort of an outline of sort of what I'm going to talk about, just so you can follow along a bit. And so I'm not sure if I gave it this title or if I blame it on you guys. I mean, theories and methods of European identity research. I mean, first of all, it's after lunch. Your tummies are full. Did you have a good hot German lunch? I didn't notice. Oh, okay. So they're chintzing on you. Okay. But your tummies are full. You're like getting a little tired. Have a big long session this morning, and then you get theories and methods of European identity research, snoozeville. So the first thing is we have to sex up the title, make it more exciting. So I retitled it. That's what my notes say: Constructing European Identity, the EU, Institutions, and Social Practice. It's still really nerdy and academic, but at least it's not theories and methods of European identity research. But I think along the way I will talk about different kinds of theories. Not so much explicitly about methods, although that'll be implicit and we can certainly talk about it. I mean, I say a little bit about methods. But I guess it's really more about theories, emphasis on the plural of how to do this stuff. And I noticed actually from the list of disciplines, you're actually mostly political scientists, right? It looks like 12. That's too bad. I'm a political scientist, so I know what happens to you. It's okay, it's okay. You didn't make a mistake. It's fine. I'm still a political scientist. I was a physicist first, and then I got really confused and went to political science. Went from fake science to real science, right? Yeah. My undergraduates, I always start out by saying, oh, you know, I studied physics first. And they go, wow, it's like you knew real science? And then I thought, because that's always the reaction they have, right? And then I immediately thought that my favorite story about physics, it was actually astrophysics I studied, so physics of the universe, right? You know, we don't like having unexplained variance, right? And so, you know, there's this little thing called the missing mass. If you've ever heard of it about the universe, the best astrophysical fundamental theories of physics we have about how much the universe should weigh, they can't find 40% of the weight. Oh, that's real science, right? Just 40% missing, you know. But anyway, but now that we found the God particle nearby in CERN, everything is okay. And the world didn't disappear into a black hole, as some people in America thought was going to happen. You can see I'm procrastinating because I'm jet lagged from yesterday, and I'm trying to get moving here. There is really a lecture here. There's like 4 pages of stuff, okay? You've got the handout. It shows there's something there. I am a bit jet lagged, but I think that's making me a little bit punchy, if anything, so hopefully it will be all for the better. Yeah, okay, so the title, I really did retitle it Constructing European Identity, the EU, the Institutions, and Social Practice. And I kind of built this lecture. So at the bottom of that handout, there's 3 books listed there, which, you know, you're probably familiar with or heard of, or perhaps read them all. I mean, you certainly hopefully read part of Checkel and Katzenstein for today, but Neil Fligstein's book, and then Thomas Rees's book. I mean, thanks to these 3 books, but thanks to a lot of other stuff, books, articles, all kinds of things. We know lots about European identity, which I don't need to tell you folks. And we know lots in kind of an empirical social science way. I mean, how you measure it, you have debates about how you measure it, how you theorize it. And then, that's a big change from when I first started getting interested, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago in the subject, because then it was still very much sort of a normative debate, sort of the kind of identity Europe ought to have, given the way the EU was developing and the like. And that's still a very important part of the contemporary debate over European identity. But in addition to that, we've got a lot of quite serious empirical social science. And these 3 books I list here are just sort of, scratching the surface of what that literature has produced over the past decade. And, if I had to kind of summarize in a nutshell, which again, I know you all know, I mean, sort of, my sense of, what's the takeaway? What do we know after all this research? Well, I mean, there is something there that is new when viewed in historical or contemporary perspective, this sense of collective we-ness and identification with Europe. And it's all the more striking when you put it in a cross-regional perspective. Because it's basically totally absent, right, in other regions. And I teach these Canadians in Vancouver, and we talk a little bit about this stuff, and I sort of ask them, so what's your North American identity? They've never heard of it, right? We know we're not those fat Americans down south of the border. Okay, maybe that's part of it. And what role has NAFTA played in shaping your sense of common understanding? What's NAFTA? North American Free Trade Agreement. But yeah, I mean, so there is no North American identity to speak of, really. Asian identity, well, maybe you could have some discussion there, but probably not much. So the sense of collective we-ness that seems to have developed here, at least in some segment of the populace, does seem quite unique in a sort of cross-regional perspective. We do know that European institutions have played a key role in facilitating the development of this identity. And you're sort of asked to counterfactual. Absent the EU, I wouldn't even be here talking today. Probably. Okay, you wouldn't be having this whole school, maybe. And elites within these European institutions have consciously sought to create this identity. And it's kind of like an engineering view of identity. It's something we craft, construct, sort of build it from the top down, as it were. What else do we know? Well, I mean, sounds like you're researching this. We know it's not either or, but it's both and when it comes to national European identities. National identities don't seem to be disappearing as European identity, at least in some places, develops. So that's kind of, in a really hyper-condensed nutshell, at least what I know, what I think I've learned over the past decade. But, I mean, like any kind of research program, that's why you're all doing PhDs, right? Or I guess a few people beyond. Is that right? A couple of people are beyond the PhD, actually? Is that right, from what I heard? Okay, maybe it was just you. Okay, but okay, doesn't matter. But there's a lot I don't think know, or there actually might be some important biases in some of the way we've been going about studying European identity. And that's kind of one of the things I want to argue, that the findings we have on European identity are incomplete and perhaps even really biased. And this comes about for theoretical reasons and data problems. In terms of theory, I think there's some theoretical limitations in what are often the standard toolkits used by political scientists, Europeanists, and I'll say constructivists, in sort of thinking about how identity is formed. I think in an important way, all these folks give a lot of emphasis to what we say over what we do in terms of how identities are constructed. And they also pay a lot of attention to institutions, which is a very political sciencey kind of thing to do. If you're a Europeanist, you do that as well. But those approaches have important limitations we need to be aware of, okay? And then beyond that, I mean, beyond theory, we sort of have data problems. And yet one kind of data problem, which is like old news, and I'm not really going to say that much about it, but, you know, there's, and really not many people, well, I shouldn't say that. It's increasingly recognized the limitations of sort of a particular way of capturing identity, and so like Eurobarometer, right? The favorite little question there. You know, that's arguably a very what's the proper polite way to put it? Incomplete way of trying to capture and measure identity. So that's kind of one kind of data problem, but you know, I think that's increasingly people all know that. But the other data problem, which in theory can be rectified with time, and I think it already is, you know, Europe's changing or has changed, right? And, you know, especially about the EU, you know, the EU 15 doesn't exist anymore, obviously. It's EU 27. And so how do the enlargements of 2004, 2007 play into the arguments we have about European identity? I think that's a very important question, one that I have some quite lively disagreements with some of my colleagues about sort of how to interpret what's going on post-enlargement 2004, 2007 in terms of this broader set of issues having about European identity. And if I have a bottom line, which has really come out of this, trying to study this stuff for a long time, it's that future work on European identity must move beyond a fixation on the EU, beyond institutional analysis, sorry, political scientists, and beyond kind of nice social interaction. And I'll explain what I mean by that later, while taking seriously the reality that the old sort of cozy West European club, the EU15, no longer exists. And I think that really has big implications for what's going on in terms of identity today in Europe. Now, I should qualify or be careful here. I mean, you know, so I'm not, this is not an argument like that's trashing all existing work and saying, oh, it's like it's all worthless, and because it's not. I mean, I wouldn't be, yeah, it's not. Rather, it's a plea for a richer, more integrative, theoretical, methodological frame for thinking about European identity that builds upon what we know already. And one issue I'm not going to address, and we can come back to in the Q&A because it's very relevant for you folks working on PhDs, is sure, you can sort of say, me, Jeff, can say, oh, yes, have this more richer, integrative, theoretical, methodological frame, but we have to do PhDs in 3 or 4 years, and how do we have the time to do it? And we can come back and talk about that. That's a very important, practical question in the Q&A. Okay, so what I want to do then is, sort of develop this argument in 3 parts. First of all, exploring in a very kind of general way some generic ways in which identity is made or changed. And then thinking a bit more about what I call the missing Europeans and these work on European identity, basically Europeans from East Central Europe. And then a little bit sort of speculating on the future development of European identity. And I welcome your input here because I'm just revising a chapter now for a book on a book by Thomas Riese for Cambridge, and he beat me over the head and said, your whole chapter says nothing about the implications of the current Euro crisis for European identity and European public spheres in this case. So please give me ideas about how the Euro crisis is making it all better or completely eliminating these issues or whatever. Yeah, I have a little bit to say about that at the very end, but I mean, that's very preliminary. I'll welcome your feedback. So, I mean, a couple comments before I sort of launch into this stuff. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to play off and reference these 3 books that are listed at the bottom of the handout. Has everybody at least heard of those 3 books? I mean, you probably, okay, sorry, that's probably the insulting question. I mean, of course you have. You've probably read them all. Just to make sure we're like roughly on the same wavelength here. Good. But I do know, I mean, in terms of today, I only asked you to look at parts of the one by Checkel and Katzenstein, although one of the chapters there is by Flickstein, where he basically summarizes in the chapter his whole 300-page book. Yeah, and so, you know, my second comment before I start is, I mean, I am critical of the arguments in these books, but please, including critical of the arguments in the Checkel-Katzenstein one, okay, and I can ask me at the end what the fundamental weaknesses of Checkel and Katzenstein, because I'm not going to say it, and you can tell me what it is, okay, because there is a fundamental weakness. There always is, right? So I'm going to be critical of these books, but I mean, please keep the criticism in context. You know, the books are really well crafted and written, and when books are well crafted and written, it's easy for sympathetic readers to come along and identify the gaps, what's missing, and the like. Okay, so it's made my job easier that they're so well written and put together. And again, my criticisms are meant to be constructive. How do we build upon these works? What did he tell us about the cutting edge in terms of theory and method? And yes, it's constructive, nice criticism, because the final thing I should say, these people are all my friends, so I'm not going to say anything really nasty about them, right? Because you're never going to say, oh, we heard Checkel saying horrible things about you. Risa, who is from Berlin, you'll go back and say, oh, Thomas, yeah. He knows I think he's junk anyway. He always tells me, I think, anyway. Yeah, okay. So let me begin what I call... Yeah, so it's Roman numeral 2 on the handout. The making and changing of identity, 3 stories. And you can see, I mean, well, yeah, these stories, sort of the first one has to do with sort of what we say and how that shapes who we are to some extent. Second story is a more interactionist one, sort of social interaction at the mass level. The first one is kind of very much elite. The third story is about daily lived experience, called it social practice, perhaps at a more societal level that doesn't necessarily have to be. Let me work through these 3 stories and then say something about what they mean for how we should be studying identity in Europe. So the first story, or one story to begin, to explain a change or an evolution in European identity, a central role must be accorded to, and here's the buzz phrases, public discourses, public spheres, communicative practices, communicative spaces, and communities of communication. Lots of talk. Yeah? I like to do this, and I don't know if it's going to work. I'm old. Wow, okay. It's a high thing, you know. And the microphone's working, I guess? It's okay. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I didn't. If this is filming, is it bad that I'm moving around? It's like... Are there cameras in our hotel rooms, too? I saw that something up on... Because he probably knew I was at breakfast before he even got there. So yeah, this thing I signed today was very serious. It said, you know, we have a right to watch and observe you anywhere, any place, anytime. Post it all on YouTube and the web. So if you guys didn't know that, too, there's cameras in each one of your rooms. Okay. That's a joke, that's a joke, that's a joke. I'm kidding, I'm kidding. Sometimes students don't realize I'm just kidding. Okay, so, this first story. To explain a change in evolution in European identity, all the stuff I just mentioned seems to matter. Public discourses, public spheres, communicative practices, communities of communication. This is a perspective that's been developed by, well, in terms of the books here, this is Thomas Ries's book. A lot of other work on public spheres, for sure, that he's building upon and actually summarizing in that book. So it's basically sort of a political science, and I would argue kind of social constructivist view of what shapes identity. And it's basically saying that, I mean, I'm really simplifying here, but it's saying that sort of talk, what we say, produces identity. Now that's true, actually. It's definitely true. But, I mean, there's a couple things built into that, at least the way sort of the arguments have been developed, that we should sort of pull out and think about. First of all, it's at least the way it's been developed by Europeanists, it's a deeply EU-centric view of how identity change works. Because all these things that at least Ries and a lot of other people looking at Europeanized public spheres are studying, I mean, again, they wouldn't be studying this if it weren't for the EU, basically. I mean, it's the EU facilitating this stuff, okay? So it's a deeply EU-centric view of how identity change works, which is okay, but we sort of need to ask, it's going to be sort of a consistent theme today, well, in the different arenas in which identities are being constructed, so maybe this arena, European public spheres, accounts for maybe 1% of it. And if 99% is being crafted elsewhere, well, why are we wasting our time studying that 1%? I mean, that's not a waste of time, okay? But anyway, that's something to be thinking about. It's a very deeply EU-centric view of how identity change works. And we know, you all know this, right? And they talk about it in the Riese book, and you know it from other stuff, that the extensive institutionalization of the EU has facilitated all sorts of communication. Okay, I mean, we know that. So it's a deeply EU-centric view. It's also, at least in terms of how it's typically measured, a very elitist view. Quality newspapers, right? That's all the buzz phrase there. Why not have Bild Zeitung in there and whatever do all the trash newspapers right across Europe, right? Not trash newspapers, whatever, popular. Is Bild Zeitung, is that kind of the mass popular one here? Yeah, so, as opposed to Süddeutsche Zeitung and Le Monde and Le Pays and the ones they always have in these European public sphere studies. So, okay, it's elite level discourse. Elites are important. Any political, well, it varies as a function of the political system, but elites, are important. But again, is it like 2% and 98% are elsewhere? We need to think about that. So that's the first story. And, if you've read the Riese book or these studies about public spheres, I mean, public spheres in general, and then the work on European public spheres, something clearly seems to be happening that wasn't there a decade ago or 2 decades ago in terms of some common arenas of communication. And I think it's easier trying to document that that's going on, okay, which I think they have documented. The more challenging analytic step, and this is where I have disagreements with Thomas, is to link what's going on in terms of these common arenas of communication through some kind of causal process to changes in how people collectively self-identify. I'm not sure that latter link has actually been that well established at this point. Anyway, that's kind of our first story. Second story, to explain a change in evolution in European identity, a central role must be accorded to contact interaction more at the mass level. This is more of a sociological argument. It's certainly the argument in Neil Flickstein's book, if you had a look at that, and you get a sense of that in his chapter that I asked you to look at in the Checkel-Katzenstein book. Basically Neil argues that over time, the development of the EU's internal market, and again, very EU-centric, right, has led to increasing interaction and common identification amongst the cross-section of Europeans. Who are these Europeans? Upper middle class, winners of European integration, not the losers. It's small. His own numbers suggest it's maybe like 12%. I mean, true Europeans in the way he sort of operationalizes it. And Neil's numbers are amazing. I mean, this book, if you've looked at it, is just incredible in the best kind of sociological way. The massive amounts of data he brings to bear on what's been a desperately kind of needed addition to this discussion about identity on a more sociological, to societal level view of identity construction. So, what he finds is this sort of smallish group of upper middle class winners of integration. And what he documents in this book, or what Flickstein's documented, right, is this the increasing amount of daily interaction amongst these people in all kinds of forms and in ways, professional associations, in all kinds of ways, right? And the data, I mean, I think is probably the strongest part of sort of his argument there. It's just amazing sort of what he's collected. The theoretical argument is rooted in parts of social psychology. Heard a couple of you say that's where you were working. Sort of an argument that, coming together, interacting, coming into contact promotes feelings of we-ness. Sorry. Oh, don't rub the hand there. Contact hypothesis. That's an old one for social psychology. Come together, rub elbows, become more alike. Maybe. Again, Neil's argument is very interesting. The data there is very impressive. But again, it's a deeply EU-centric view of contemporary identity terrain in Europe. The interaction he's mapping and measuring is being caused, facilitated by essentially the workings of the internal market. Yeah. So it's very EU-centric, like RISA. It also assumes that contact, this kind of rubbing of elbows, promotes collective identification. There's a common expression we have in English that I like to turn around in the following way. There's nothing that breeds contempt like familiarity. Right? The more you hang out with somebody and get to know them, the more you're like, God, what a twit. Jerks. But it's like, come together, rub elbows, we're more alike. Furthermore, it assumes implicitly it's simply the amount of interaction. Sort of as interaction increases, common identification should increase. Maybe it has nothing to do with the quantity of interaction and everything to do with the quality of the interaction. Are you hanging out, deliberating, having long discussions over whatever? Or are you sitting there in sort of one-off exchanges and for 5 minutes? It actually might be the quality that matters more than the quantity of the interaction. So that's kind of a second perspective with its sort of, interesting take on questions of identity in Europe, and then sort of what's possibly sort of a bit kind of hidden in that approach. And that is a third story. To explain the change and evolution of European identity, a central role must be accorded to social practice and daily lived experience. And this is a perspective, there were actually nobody from anthropology here, right? Okay. I mean, this is a perspective that comes from parts of sociology, certainly from anthropology. And it argues that identities evolve and change more by what we do than what we say. And this is certainly part, if you picked up on it, part of the argumentation in the book by Katzenstein and I, who are like recovering political scientists, right? If you notice, we're the only political scientists in that collection, and that was done quite intentionally. Because we actually did think sort of political science had gone a bit astray in sort of the way it was thinking about questions of identity. But that is part of the argumentation in the Checkel and Katzenstein book. And it really draws upon, I call it bottom-up theory, as opposed to the top-down where elites are constructing things bottom-up, from the ground-up theory from anthropology and sociology, that looks more to daily lives of Europeans and how social practice and lived experience may be reshaping senses of identity. So, perhaps the same individuals who create European public spheres, a la Risa, or come into regular contact through the internal market, meeting 3 times a month in some European association, a la Flickstein. Perhaps those same people, at the end of every week, I mean, that's a bit unrealistic, twice a year for their summer and especially winter holidays, especially if they're good Northern Europeans, head to the beaches of southern Spain. And when they get there, consciously recreate their own national communities, which we see happening. I know the Norwegian case best because I lived in Norway. They've created Norway down on the southern coast of Spain. The schools are down there. The teachers are paid to go teach there. Often posted in the main Norwegian national newspaper. Local edition is printed, right? And it's not just the Norwegians that are doing this. So, the same person who answers to the Eurobarometer thing, yes, I'm both and this and that, European and whatever, who is a part of Risa's public sphere, who's part of Flinkstein's interaction, every weekend or twice a year, whatever, they go for, a month, 5 weeks. What are we up to here? 5 weeks? That's how much vacation do you get? 4? 4? Just 4? All right, 2 weeks in the U.S., right? Canada's a little bit more generous, but not much. You go down, and in terms of your daily lived experience, it I don't know, what's European about that? And so how does that affect your European sense of who we are? Does it override this other stuff? Does it interact with it? And here, to some extent, you have identity evolving outside, around, perhaps in opposition to the EU. Now, that's three different, and there's many other ways to think about how identities are shaped, crafted. There are different schools of theoretical thought with different foundations and different disciplines. I didn't really highlight the methodology, but typically using very different methodologies. And, you know, sort of a takeaway from the Katzenstein-Checkel book, and, well, you read chapter 1, so I guess you saw it there, is there's a danger in just sort of using one of these theoretical toolkits, and you actually need to be thinking about integrating them. But again, this brings up this more practical challenge of how you do that. Basically, how you can be interdisciplinary at a younger point in your career. And I have some thoughts on that we can come back to in the Q&A. Now, another issue at the level of theory is the three stories I just told about European identity, how it's shaped and changed. At least as they've been developed and applied in Europe, at least Europe having to do with the EU, it's always kind of nice and peaceful. Now, for sure, everybody in the world now talks about how everything is politicized, right, in Europe now. Katzenstein and myself, that's sort of a hook in our book, the politicization around questions of European identity. But politicization, sort of making issues part of politics, is, you know, kind of making issues part of normal democratic politics. There's no real violence or extreme conflict. But is that the way identities are made often? I mean, looking at all this work on European identity, I'm tempted to say, as an obnoxious American, it's just, you know, so European, so civilized, nice, and peaceful. When I was doing some of my early work on European identity, I made the mistake, actually it wasn't a mistake, it was an incredible wake-up call, of giving what later became a special issue of a journal, all the articles to a colleague of mine who's a Middle East specialist at another university. And he had the students read them all and had a good, interesting discussion. And he came back to me and he goes, Jeff, what is it with you Europeanists? Where I study identity, people die. He's a Middle East, Michael Barnett's his name. He's a specialist on the Middle East, among other things. What is it with you contemporary Europeanists, right? I mean, it's like Habermas, discourse, nice stuff. And this is healthy dose of self-criticism here, right? I mean, had all this work about persuasion. Oh, it's nice, right? You persuade each other. Sometimes. Yet in many other contexts, when you think about the dynamics of identity change, professional militaries, urban gangs, rebel groups in the Civil War, other regions, the Middle East, or a part of Europe just a couple of decades ago, Serbia under Milosevic, identity change results from things like intimidation, hazing, violence, sexual violence, and death. There's a robust literature on identity change and socialization developing in contemporary work on Civil War. Their causal mechanisms of identity change, they like completely disconnect with the stuff that's been done on European identity. And you're like in two completely, I mean, they are different worlds, right? But like they don't even talk to each other. They argue that rape is a fundamental mechanism of identity change. That's not even funny, right? And they document it and they theorize it, right? Now, thank God that apparently doesn't happen in Europe, right? Hazing in the European Commission, right? You know, they sort of like intimidate you and beat you up. I mean, not likely, right? But, you know, wouldn't it be better to develop arguments about identity that weren't... so, you know, what I'm hinting at here is, or driving at here, are we in danger of developing arguments about identity in Europe that are sui generis, that only work here? Wouldn't it be better to develop a general argument about identity, the dynamics of identity change, and then specify a set of scope conditions for how it might be operating in contemporary Europe, scope conditions which suggest these more conflictual, violent mechanisms of identity change, hazing, death, sexual violence, just are not operative or greatly minimized compared to other contexts, groups, countries. So, yeah. Identity, obvious thing to say, right? I mean, identity is not just a force for good. And I'm not saying that's the only way people study it in the European EU context, but, you know, identities in the past, actually partly in Europe, but in contemporary times, have led to things like genocide, right? And I worry a little bit that we've been developing arguments about identity in Europe that are a little bit too focused specifically on here. And to be honest, one of the reasons I moved in recent years from the work on Europe sort of to this work on civil wars, I was quite worried about my own work. I'd always thought of myself as a social scientist. I would never develop sui generis arguments that just work one place. I wanted them to travel. And then I looked back and said, wow, I developed a bunch of arguments about socialization and identity change that basically work in Europe, Western Europe, to be precise, which is okay. It's not the end of the world, right? It's important. But it left me a little sort of queasy in a broader social science sense. Anyway, so let's try to just to, finish up this discussion about identity. I mean, there is a concern I have that our current arguments on European identity are sui generis. They only work for the EU. Moreover, and this is my segue to the next set of comments, they may work, and I'm being sort of purposely a bit provocative here, so hopefully to incite you guys. Guys, gals, don't take that personally. Hopefully to incite you. So a set of arguments that are perhaps on European identity that are sui generis only work for the EU. Moreover, they only work for Europe, EU, that no longer exists. And this then brings me to Roman numeral 3, what I call the missing Europeans. Now, let me ask you a question, because we've been going 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock is when it ends, right? So I probably have about, 20 more minutes. I mean, should we finish me and then take a break, or do you need a break now? Finish me and then take a break? Okay, so finish me. Oh, there's a clock up there. Okay. More spies have just arrived. They have microphones, too. It's not just cameras, it's microphones. Everything is being taped. All the questions you ask are being taped. They're being sent back to your PhD supervisors. They haven't told you that? You didn't know that? Ooh. These two in the back, they're pretty tough. Right, then what I call the missing Europeans. And here maybe I'm just a twit, as opposed to not being a twit any other time. Twit just means you're a jerk, right? And maybe it's because I used to study the Soviet Union, and I have this sort of rather deeply learned sense that Europe as a whole is different when you begin to look at it, the different parts of it. And Europe as a whole, I'm talking from sort of UK, to Russia, okay, Turkey. So partly my sort of old Sovietological background is coming to the fore here. But I'm concerned about sort of the ease with which some of the theoretical arguments we have made about identity change in an EU that doesn't exist anymore are sort of it's being suggested that they will apply to, or do apply to, the new Europe and post the 2004, 2007 enlargement. And I'm not so sure about that. So the issue here, right, I mean, it is the two enlargements. I don't know why I'm playing with this bottle of water. I'm sorry. It's over there. The issue is the 2004, 2007 enlargements and their impact on processes of identity construction in Europe. Now, if you look at the books, and these books are a bit dated now. I mean, what, 2009, 2010? Yeah, so the research was finishing, 2008 at the latest. And you guys can let me know, because I'm not up to date, if there are new kind of data sets, new projects. I mean, I know of some that are really sort of addressing, rectifying the kind of data problems I'm about to talk about. But for scholars like Riese and Fligstein, and actually it's true for Katzenstein and Checkel too, although I think we sort of try to talk a bit more about it. They all note these enlargements, but especially for Riese and Fligstein, when they were writing, they didn't really have the data to say, how do these arguments change, or do they get modified as the EU goes from 15 to 27? So the identity stories that scholarship like Fligstein, like Riese, to some extent also Checkel and Katzenstein and Checkel, the identity stories they tell are largely limited to an EU that is no more, that doesn't exist. And everybody agrees that these enlargements have changed things, right? I mean, it's obvious you go from 15 to 27, it's different. Simply the numbers count them, 15 to 27 nation states. A lot of people, and I guess this is certainly a theme in Katzenstein and Checkel, view these enlargements as meaning sort of history and religion have returned, come back to the EU in ways that they were perhaps not there before. So there's kind of agreement at that very general level. That this enlargement has happened. Yes, it has some bearing on these issues of identification with Europe. But analytically, and here's the rub, we disagree on how to understand the impact of enlargement on the evolution of European identity. And there's kind of two really generalized, simplistic ways I'll sort of portray how you can understand this impact of enlargement on the evolution of European identity. One possibility I'd call sort of it's the EU as modernization project. Enlargement's causal impact on identity is relatively small. The past is the future. We've seen other countries, well, the original EU 15, right? I mean, 40 years ago, what was there in terms of a European identity? Nothing. Well, what is there today? There's something, right? Well, as the same processes take in these new member states, processes that are all much more accelerated today, the internal market, the acquis, Eurozone, to the extent they still exist, cooperation on defense, foreign policy, blah, 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 right? As all these sort of mechanisms of Europeanization kick in, along with structural funding, all kinds of stuff, you know, I mean, broadly the same set of patterns we've seen in Western Europe will be replicated in the East, okay? So the future is the past. I may have missaid that a few minutes ago. The future is the past, right? We can understand the future by looking at sort of how Europeanization worked in the EU 15 and sort of extrapolating that to an EU 27 and noting that the Europeanization that occurs now is significantly more intense than, say, what was going on 15, 20 years ago in the old EU 15. And all that suggests that, you know, yeah, so we should see sort of a continuation of what we've been seeing now, this sort of, you know, what Risa calls European identity light. He's not the only one that says this, right? I mean, sort of some secondary identification with Europe, but still keeping a strong sense of national identification. The sense of European identity not broadly held amongst populaces, the numbers rather small, but probably growing slowly over time. So that's one possibility. What I call the EU sort of as a modernization project. It's sort of the EU is kind of this this thing that comes along, wears down slowly. Not all, for sure, because nobody's ever argued that. A lot of national differences as people join the club and begin to identify with it. Well, maybe. But there's a second possibility, I think, about how enlargement is going to play out. And that's enlargement is playing out, helping facilitate, because it's there outside of Europe as well, a fracturing of multiple modernities. And from this perspective, the causal impact of the enlargements on identity dynamics in Europe is huge. And quite possibly negative in the sense that the heyday of sort of European identity may be past. And it may be like this, or maybe trending down. And I don't just mean Eurobarometer, okay, other methods and other ways of measuring identity. Now, I mean, I hinted at before and, you know, put this out in the open. This is where I've been having an ongoing fight with Thomas Risa. He broadly sort of adopts the first perspective, that you know, yes, enlargement is going to bring about change, but not hugely radical change in terms of these identity dynamics. Whereas you could probably pick up from the chapters that I should look at, the Katzenstein-Checkel book, thinks the second scenario is more likely, in that enlargement will drastically slow the formation of the community of Europeans and European identity that Risa and Flickstein have documented is developing or has been developing for a good while now. The historical memory of East and East Central Europe are different. They're not better, they're not worse, they're different than Western Europe. And I appreciate Western Europe's not all the same, so to some extent I'm reifying it a bit here and grouping them all together. Actually, more recently, that's clearly not a viable assumption anymore, as we've watched West Europe sort of begin to fracture in its own way because of the Euro crisis. But, you know, in East Central Europe, their history and historical memory are just different. And this does matter. And that's why I asked you to look at the chapter by Holly case in the Checkel-Katzenstein book. One of the first workshops for that, what became that Checkel-Katzenstein, the first workshop for what became that Checkel-Katzenstein book, it was at Cornell University, and we had invited a bunch of people. It was brainstorming. A lot of people didn't end up in the final book. And luckily, we invited a scholar from Cornell who was a specialist on East Europe, Valerie Bunce, a political scientist. And at one point, we've been going on for a day and a half. It was all West Europe this, West Europe that. And Val, to her infinite credit, didn't just get mad. She blew her top at us. She started screaming at the whole room. She said, I cannot believe a group of 35 smart people are in this room talking about Europe, European identity, and ignoring half the continent, which we were doing. Okay, now that's our own fault, and that was like 6-7 years ago, and maybe it doesn't happen anymore, I hope. But, you know, it was a real, I mean, Peter and I had this inclination already, but it was a real wake-up call for us early in the project that, you know, we've got to think more seriously about how this reunification process of Europe is going to be shaping some of the arguments we've been making about identity in Europe. And, you know, our hunch, and, you know, it's a hunch because we don't have the data, certainly not in that book, is that the impact is going to be along this kind of fracturing multiplication of identities that we talk about. And again, the way we're going to see that is not just looking at Eurobarometer surveys, which are now extended, of course, to the new member states, but also more sociological, anthropological research, which does take more time to come on stream and see what it is finding about what's going on sort of more from the bottom up, the ground up in East Central Europe. Okay. Some concluding remarks then, and then I guess we'll take a break. Yeah, what do I call this? Wither European identity. And I would certainly, I think you guys know, there's no consensus on where it's going, how it's developing. If you just look at the authors that are on the list, for Thomas Riese, the glass is definitely half full. If you read the last paragraph in the book, it's really, really clear. And, you know, there's a general sense of optimism that actually the current crises, now this was written, you know, before certainly the sovereign debt euro crisis, or was just sort of getting underway. But actually, I mean, I know from this other project I'm involved with him in right now, as he hasn't sort of changed that bottom line. You know, he sort of sees the glass glass of European identity as half full. Flickstein, he's extremely cautious, hedging his bets sort of all over the place. But the implication of his findings is that European identity is a preserve of a smallish upper middle class elite. You know, that 12% maybe. 12% has to deal with 88%, right? Or the interaction between the two. And Checkel-Katzenstein, and you know, it didn't start out this way. We weren't really sure what we were going to. I don't know if we have a bottom line, but what we're going to conclude. But you know, after finishing the book and looking at sort of what people had produced for us, People, again, with the two exceptions of Katzenstein and myself, were not political scientists. We definitely see the glass as half empty, the glass of European identity. I just want to read you the first paragraph from page 1 of the book. And this is the academic prose I am the most proud of that I've ever written. It was co-written, and Katzenstein and I, we took turns at this. And if you're prone to seasickness, you're going to get a queasy stomach. Okay, you should have read this hopefully. Okay. So it's the paragraph 1, page 1 of the book, chapter 1. The ship of European identity has entered uncharted waters. Its sails are flapping in a stiff breeze. Beyond the harbor, whitecaps are signaling stormy weather ahead. The crew is fully assembled, but some members are grumbling loudly. While food and drink are plentiful, maps and binoculars are missing. Officers are vying for rank and position as no captain is in sight. Sensing a lack of direction and brooding bad weather, some passengers are resting in the fading sun on easy chairs, thinking of past accomplishments. Others are huddling in an openly defiant mood close to the lifeboats, anticipating bad times ahead. With the journey's destination unknown, the trip ahead seems excruciatingly difficult to some, positively dangerous to others. Anxiety and uncertainty, not hope and self-confidence, define the moment. Yeah. Now we go on right in the next paragraph to say many European elites would not like the sketch we just put forth. But we think it's a sketch that captures a hell of a lot of what's going on in contemporary Europe, especially when you get beyond the elite level in the European Union and how it's feeding into the processes of identity formation. So yeah, Checkel and Katzenstein definitely sort of see the glass as half empty. So who's right? I mean, that's a stupid question to ask. I don't know who's right. It's social science. It's not rocket science. Everybody's right, okay? Can be more right. But, seriously, so what this all says is we've got lots of disagreement, lots of gaps to be plugged. So it's great that there's all of you here for this course and doing these dissertations. But, I think it does point to an important implication for how we do work on European identity. Yeah, we always need more research on topics that's a truism, right? It says nothing really. But we need research that actually cuts across standard theoretical methodological fault lines and compartmentalizations. And that's it's a bit of a buzzword right now, at least in some places, interdisciplinarity. I mean, my university in Vancouver, my school is interdisciplinary, right? Our major is interdisciplinary. And it's a big buzzword with funding agencies, at least in North America. I'm not sure if that's sort of the commission spewing out this gobbledygook too. But it's not gobbledygook. Well, maybe it is. But, I think it actually really matters in terms of generating important substantive knowledge about the EU, European identity. Knowledge is never going to be perfect, right? Because it is social science, so it's not perfect. But, at least by being more interdisciplinary, stepping out of our little comfort zones of our little, places we're comfortable with the theories and concepts, we minimize the likelihood of having these kinds of gaps and biases that I think are out there in a lot of some of the best scholarship we have right now. And that is, I think, that a situation we want to try to move beyond. Whoops. And then finally, and this is where, in the Q&A we can come back to it and you can help me figure out this issue. I mean, does European identity matter? And actually, I don't know the answer to this, so you guys can really help me. I mean, of course it matters, right? So that's a dumb question to ask. But, sort of European identity crafted, impelled, pushed by the European Union. Yeah. Does it matter? Is it maybe just 2% of sort of the broader set of dynamics shaping identities in contemporary Europe? So why aren't we studying the other 98%? Or the interaction of the other 98% with the stuff coming out of the EU? If there is a bias towards the EU, is that shaped by funding priorities of certain people who provide the money? There's a mathly loaded question I just asked about the European Commission and its funding priorities. Having said all that, yeah, I mean, it obviously matters for European identity matters for two reasons. And the one that I can't really get a handle on, or I don't fully know how to answer, is, having this sense of community of communication, whatever you want to call it, matters for functional reasons. So, you could argue one of the reasons the EU has not been terribly with it in responding to the Euro sovereign debt crisis is kind of a lack of solidarity. It's not all Angela Merkel's fault, or Berlusconi's fault, or whoever. And so, often it comes down to very utilitarian calculations about, well, what's in it for us if we bail them out? Where's the sense of we're all in it together? So, it matters for functional reasons, but I think a lot more needs to be said about how the current Euro crisis is playing into these identity dynamics. And then sort of this long-running reason that we all know, the questions of identification with Europe matter. It's this project of building sort of a more democratic Europe. So questions of European identity matter for legitimacy reasons, for sure. And give me comments too. It doesn't have to be questions. Could be based on the reading, because obviously I didn't even talk about some of the chapters I asked you to look at, Adrian, Vels, and whatever. Or it can be about things I said during the lecture to push me to whatever, better specify or backtrack or nuance my argument. Oh no, it's going to be about Eastern Europe. Go ahead.
I shouldn't speak to you during the break.
He was talking about it during the break, so I knew it was coming.
So yes, I wanted to ask you to say something more on this distinction between new and old Europe, because I think that almost 9 years after the enlargement, we can see that this distinction needs to be reconsidered. That is quite a problematic category right now, as we analyze, for example, cultural markers that are right now less different than we could expect. And also, for example, you wrote a lot on religion and the new role of religion after the enlargement. And from my perspective, these differences are not that big as we could expect them to be. Mm-hmm. So there is also probably a big influence there is a different direction. The core of, so to say, Western Europe influences the secularization in Eastern Europe. And also the other thing are these differences within New Europe. As I told you, the differences between Poland and Czech Republic in terms of religiosity is probably bigger than the difference between Poland and France, because, for example, of the role of political Catholicism in both countries. So I want to ask you to say something on that. And the second question that I have is on this. You are talking that we need research on European identity, which is not focused only on the EU. So I want to ask you, what are the most important actors here, apart from the European Union? Thank you.
Okay. So I guess, I basically just answer, and then we'll go on to something else. And I guess since we have just about 40 minutes, I'll be brief. And if I'm too brief, come up to me afterwards or something, or maybe because I don't know the answer, and that's actually why I'm being brief. So, Mikhail, right? His comment is very... The first one about New Old Europe, East Central Europe. The distinctions that Katzenstein and I made basically 6 years ago are out of date. I mean, they don't quite... They need a lot of further reflection and nuancing. And I think one thing you pick up on, the differences within Eastern Europe, which we kind of reify East Central Europe. Well, that Holly Case chapter doesn't, but I mean, we tend to sort of, in that book, we kind of reify East Central Europe. It's kind of this new thing coming in, which is just different compared to West Europe. And that reification is crying out for some parsing out things. So that should be done. At the same time, it's not exactly what your question was pushing at, but, and maybe this is a function of what's been happening the last 3 or 4 years, there's a tendency among some people, maybe it's me, I've been told that I sort of tend to reify West Europe. Like, they're all the same, and it's not, right? And certainly in some of what's been happening over the last 4 years with the Euro sovereign debt crisis, we've seen dynamics within Western Europe that really drive home that there's some very different dynamics going on. But I mean, to bring us all to sort of, to how we study identity, I mean, I don't, until really all the data is in, I don't think it is all in, I don't want to let go of exploring how the addition of 12 new member states changes some of the basic identity dynamics we have been seeing develop in West Europe. I agree we need to nuance considerably kind of the simple East-West dichotomy or whatever that Katzenstein put up. But I don't want to, at this point anyway, sort of put that aside as something that we should be looking at to see if there's something be sort of regional distinctions in Europe, something that may be shaping in some quite different ways the kind of identity processes we've seen develop in Western Europe. The second question, who we should study, that's actually a really good one. Well, it's a lot of things, right? So you want to understand contemporary identity dynamics in Europe. Yeah, look at the EU, right? Sure, that's part of it. Look at the whole set of dynamics, political parties, movements, diasporas around migration, migrants, right? And Favel talks a little bit about that in his chapter. The impact of globalization. I mean, as an actor, I don't know if that's how much of it. Did I ask you to look at Doug Holmes' chapter in the Katzenstein Checkel book? Did I? No. No? Yeah, it was chapter 1, and then, oh no, wait, did I? Was one called Integral Europe or something? Okay, so I didn't ask. Doug Holmes was an anthropologist. Okay, I didn't ask you to read his chapter. A lot of what he studied, sort of down on the ground, out in the fields, literally, of France, are local entrepreneurs, agents responding to two things: Europe, the EU, and globalization. And it's not always so clear how you can disentangle those. But certainly globalization, I mean, not really an actor, but a process that should be studied. Political parties and how a more kind of an engineering view of identity, how they've been crafting, manipulating, shaping senses of identification. So, I mean, it's a lot of stuff, right? And, you know, you have to make some choices about what to limit it to. And I'm not quite sure sort of how you would come up with a criteria of what to include and what not. But I think as an important starting point, you need to sort of be looking beyond that part of identity being shaped by the European Union. Because, again, I think that's just sort of one part of the story. Other questions or comments? Yes. Say your name again.
Marco. I'm Marco. I have a question. Okay, one concerning methodology regarding I think a book chapter you wrote some time ago concerning social constructivism and how to reconcile the positivist, more Wendtian approach and the interpretative approach. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering exactly how do you mean this in epistemological terms? Because I like the idea very much, but then when I talked about it, several professors told me, well, you have to choose. You either have to go positivist. So, I mean, they were in a way repeating once again the division that you referred to in your book chapter. And the other question was, about the role of the cultural other in European identity. So the kind of Ivor Neumann approach to Russia and Turkey. I was wondering, how do you think that Europe is dealing with the construction of the other today? Do you see any role for the other today in European identity? Thanks.
Which other is it? Russia, Turkey, the U.S.?
Yeah, and others potentially.
Others.
Also internal others, by the way, that might be very important as well.
Okay, those are two good sets of questions. The first one, epistemology. So tell your advisor to take his foot off the accelerator, relax. Okay? What I mean by that is, yeah, I mean, in a philosophical world, at the rarefied abstract world, it's apples and oranges. Can't put them together. Interpretivism, positivism. But look at applied empirical social science research. The black and white distinctions of epistemology start becoming gray. Okay. And I think some of the best research exploits that gray. Okay, so to give you an example, on identity in Europe, which has nothing to do with the EU, it's a guy named Ted Hopf, H-O-P-F. He's actually written 2 books now, but the first one on Soviet and now Russian identity. Okay, that's an important book about identity in Europe, which has nothing to do about the EU, which makes sense because it's about the Soviet Union and Russia. And Russia as of 1999, when it was not having much to do with the EU. Not that it has that much more now, I guess, even, except providing all your gas. And being Gerhard Schroeder's best friend or whatever. But, so that's a book on European identity, which does precisely this. I mean, Ted, first of all, he's sort of an opening theory method chapter which says exactly this. I mean, he really addresses your question. So if you haven't taken a look at it, because he says, in an abstract philosophical world, you cannot combine these two things. Positivism is about causal relationships, holding something constant, this connecting to that. And interpretivism is something different. It's about recreating the meaning the actors themselves held for something, not establishing causal relationships, no concern with generalization, whatever, right? Or little concern with generalization. And Huff in the first chapter argues that you don't have to put it in those either-or terms, and he actually shows some of the best positivist-inspired research has strong interpretive undertones in it, and some of the best interpretive research actually addresses positivist-inspired concerns. But more importantly, he sort of shows you how you develop a research design to put the two together. And it's not perfect. So at some level, it's a bit of a cheat, right? So here's what he does. So the book is about how identity shapes what the Soviet Union and then what Russia now does internationally. Okay. And basically, there's two case studies, 2 years, 1954, I believe it is, in 1999. And for 1954, what he does, and let's just do the 1954 one, so this is the Soviet Union. And he has better data here because the archives are more open he, first of all, in a deeply interpretive way, tries to recreate how Soviet people's own self-understanding of who they were in 1954. He doesn't theorize at all about sort of how you should think about identity and how identities are formed. He just goes and basically reads a lot of stuff. Okay. From newspapers to novels to summaries of literary conferences, and tries to grasp different kinds of ways Russians self-identify. And he does that, okay? And it's a lot more complicated than just described, but he does that in a very systematic way. That's inductive, interpretive, I think is the best meaning of the term. Identities, there's multiple identities, they're in flux, right? Okay, that's interpretive, right? That's the first part of the research design. Then part two, turn the switch. Those identities become a variable. They're fixed. And they're fed into a causal process tracing case study that asks, if we've got these identities, how are they actually, when I read Politburo transcripts, the Politburo was the highest decision-making body in the Soviet Union, when I read transcripts of decision-making, can I see an impact of those identity conceptions constraining the choices, the actual choices of Soviet foreign policy makers? This is a very standard, positivist, causal process tracing study. So it's a two-part research design over time. The first part is interpretive, and then he puts that away and does the second part, which is positivist. I think that's great. I see nothing wrong with it. In the sense that, has he given us better, new, different knowledge about why the Soviet Union did what it did in the world? Yes. He's done that by broadening his epistemological worldview to incorporate insights from both positivism and interpretivism. Now, where some people might, hit at him and say you just can't do that is you can't be an interpretivist and then sort of put it away at 9 o'clock and become a positivist. Well, he did it. I'm sorry, and I think it works. And there I'm not enough of a philosopher, right? I don't give a shit at the end of the day, right? Epistemology is important. We need to understand it, right? But if it becomes a hindrance to doing good empirical social science, then it bugs me, okay? And the argument I've heard way too often, I'm not picking on your advisor or whoever, right, is an argument along those lines which stops good empirical social science from being done. You do one or the other. Now, the reality is there's very few Ted Hops in the world. Now, why is that? Right? I don't think it's because, his work has been viewed as, oh, this stinks, this is crap. That's not my sense how it's been received, right? I think this goes back to another practical issue. It's not easy to do because you have to understand and be able to use two very different methodological toolkits, right? And most of us, I mean, I would guess, I assume it's still true for you, you're probably trained more sort of in a positivist-inspired tradition or more of an interpretive tradition. It's usually not both, okay? So I think there's sort of practical reasons we don't see more of those kinds of Ted Hopf type research designs, not a principled reason. Although for some sort of pure, more philosophically inclined people who think about epistemology, they would say you are combining apples and oranges. So that's all I would. And I mean, that's an issue I've actually engaged a lot with, and I've thought a lot about, and I've looked at people like Hopf and what they do. And having sort of done this stuff for 25 years, I mean, I think that is kind of where the future lies, that kind of pluralist, methodological perspective. And it's plural methodologically in a much more deeper way than the current fad right now for mixed methods, at least in the US and North America. It's all about mixed methods. It's all about mixing methods within positivism. Case studies and some quantitative thing, formal theory and some process tracing, right? This is a much more ambitious mixed method, right? Because it's taking methods from different epistemological starting points, which for most of us, it's not an easy thing to grasp. Although I have to say, I mean, a number of kind of summer schools you guys can choose from in terms of methods. ECPR's got 2 now, right? Summer and winter or whatever, right? There's a new one out in Singapore, and I mean they're just proliferating where you can actually within one course, one school, get both interpretive and positivist methods. I mean, I do a PhD course in Oslo. Advertisement if you're interested in Civil War stuff, which you're probably not, in about 5 weeks, where part of the course, I mean, one of the themes of the course is you can study Civil War using both interpretive and positivist methods. And when you put the two together, you know more about Civil War than if you just had the two separately, which is the same point I'm making about identity to you. Let's just spend a lot of time on your first question because I'm not quite sure how to answer the second one. So I was stalling for time trying to think. I mean, it's sort of about the others, right? I mean, they're important, but what was your specific question? I mean, sort of either Neumann, the other... yeah, it should be... Well, I mean, one thing I can say, and then I'll let you come in again. And actually, I'm trying to pull it up in saying this again, because I think he makes a really good point. There's been a tendency with this sort of othering, the uses of the other, to think that the other always has to be in an antagonistic relationship with... That's to be explored empirically, right, if it's antagonistic or not. And that's a good point I think Hopf makes again in this. It's a 2002 book from Cornell I've been talking about. But I think you wanted something more about the other, right, than just that.
Yes, I agree. I think I read also Richard Netlipau that makes exactly this point, that the other can also be positive, not necessarily negative. Right. I was wondering, actually, what role do you think that the other plays now within European identity, especially at a time of crisis? Is it still an external other, as Russia and Turkey were also before the European Union came about, or are we even too busy with internal problems to worry about the other?
Or is it an internal other, right?
Or is there an internal other as well?
I mean, this is the Euro crisis, to come to the thing I don't know how to grapple with, right? I mean, is this what's starting to, these multiple fracturing identities Katzenstein and I talk about, that was just adding East Europe to the mix, right? Prior to what's happened over the last 4 years. And, are the others now Southern Europeans, right? Those lazy Greeks. Anybody Greek here? So I think the other still is really important, but yeah, okay, I see what you're asking now. And actually, I hadn't thought about it, but I mean, I'm just speaking off the top of my head, that it'd be an interesting issue to explore, that sort of the role of an external other, be it the U.S., Turkey, Russia, might be lessened right now, given sort of the othering going on within the Union. I mean, that's just something to sort of explore, think about. Yeah, but that's a good comment. Others? Yes. Name, sorry.
Sorry, Alexandra. I was actually going to ask the same question as Michał asked in the beginning, but I wanted to talk about the difference between East and West and or the left part. But I wanted to make a further comment on that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I forgot about the microphone thing. So one thing is in terms of your response to that question, because your book is, I guess it's very influential, so to say at least, in terms of students of European identity. So I wonder whether you plan to address this issue in writing, maybe, or in a future project. And the other thing is about this concept of fracturing of multiple modernities, and I was actually also thinking in terms of the impact of European crisis specifically. Maybe you could just give us a better feeling of how this might become, because I think it might become something very relevant in the ongoing crisis situation, and how, for instance, now we look at Southern Europe and Ireland as I don't want to say victims of this whole economic development, modernization process, but countries with some problems, so maybe you can speak to that.
Okay. Again, two good questions. The first one, we're coming back to East Europe, and no, that's okay. Well, you asked kind of an easier question. I didn't really answer yours that well, but I'm going to try. Are we going to revisit the issue? In principle, yes, because when Cambridge started this series, and so that Checkel book was the first of a series, and I think a couple are out now, where the idea is each book is edited or co-edited, and it's supposed to be a state-of-the-art exploration for a particular issue. Ours was European identity. I think there's one out on normative theory, and there's a couple out now besides ours. But when they set the series up, the explicit intent was, I don't think I should remind them about this because I'm not ready to do it. After 5 or 6 years, the editors would revisit the theme and actually do a second edition, which actually would really force us to revisit a lot of things, but certainly this issue of regional variation and the role of different parts of Europe. Because, I mean, I do totally agree with what Michał was saying. It sounds like you're coming from the same direction. We portray that in vastly too simple terms, in oversimplified terms in the Katzenstein-Checkel book, and certainly, if it gets rewritten, it will have some of the nuance I was trying to suggest in answering answering Michał, and in terms of sort of the intra-Eastern European differences, right, as opposed to kind of reified East Europe versus reified West Europe, and also exploring how Western Europe should not be reified also. Now the second question, that's actually a really good one, sort of what's happening now, and sort of how to study that in terms of these, what we call these multiple fracturing identities. I can tell you sort of how not to study it. And here's my bugaboo. I guess I kind of hinted at it. You should not probably study it through administering survey instruments. Okay, be it Eurobarometer. Well, okay, there could be other survey instruments for sure that have more intelligence than Eurobarometer. That's not the way to put it. I mean, there's just an inherent limitation to surveys because, well, I don't need to rehearse this, right? I mean, it's they create a very particular kind of interaction between the person administering the survey and the respondent, and they can depending on how questions are worded, they can evoke things that people perhaps 99% of the time they never even think about on all these issues, right? Doesn't mean they're not useful to some extent still. But, I think, and possibly I can't quite imagine it, there could be kind of surveys developed that had the sensitivity to get at some of these, what we call multiple fracturing identities. But I guess when we use that term in that book, we're thinking more of sort of the multiple fracturing identities sort of bubbling up from the bottom, as it were. And that, to me, says you need more the tools of anthropology and some parts of sociology to the theories and methods to capture that. So, I mean, that's how I think answer. You want to follow up? I mean, that's how I answer the second question. Microphone, don't forget the microphone. Oh, if you want to follow, I
wasn't actually asking about the methodology, but more about the applicability of this concept. Maybe it has become something more even relevant now in the current situation.
More relevant.
Yeah.
Well, my big suspicion is, that is a suspicion because I haven't thought it through, and this is what I need your guys' help on, about what the Euro crisis has fed in here. I don't think it's been good overall. And my dear friend Thomas actually argues it's, by and large, been. I don't want to put words in his mouth. Hasn't been terribly negative for the development of European public spheres, European identity. My suspicion is the opposite, but it's sort of a suspicion that I don't have any data for that yet. And I'm not even sure sort of what the argument would be, except that it seems like stuff about the Euro crisis is driving home the importance of states and political leaders in ways that we probably should forget about when we think about these things that sort of minimize their role, public spheres, identity projects, and they're not the only thing in the Euro crisis, right? It's not just Angela Merkel and whoever, right, and the ECB, but I think some of the stuff sometimes, or arguments about identities, sort of pushes that stuff to the background, where it's kind of the sovereign debt crisis, the Euro crisis, has made it clear again, not that it's ever gone away, but this stuff matters in integrating this stuff, political leadership, state power, matters in Europe as well. And so how do we sort of bring those into our arguments about identities? I think needs some attention, definitely. Yes. Name, sorry? Oh, you're going to do it.
Josephine.
What's it again?
Josephine.
Okay.
My question is more of a general nature, really. You posed a question at the end of your presentation about does European identity matter? And you talked about, the glass being half empty or half full, and the quote from your article about, anxiety and uncertainty instead of, hope and self-confidence and all these issues. So I was wondering to what extent we're not actually talking about does it matter or not in the sense of an empirical question, but more from a normative perspective, that we want it to matter and that we want to talk about it, because if you think of that article by Brubaker and Cooper, which was really influential, saying, okay, we should abandon the term on the whole and ask different questions maybe, or and then there were a lot of articles, part of the school, all of them referred to that article, talking about whether the term identity, is the best way to approach all of these issues. So yeah, I was wondering to what extent we have a really normative perspective on this whole question of European identity, and to what extent we're not really looking at only empirical realities and try to be as neutral as possible, but that we actually really want to talk about it and want to stick to it whatever happens.
Ooh, okay. That's a good question. I think there's something to be studied there. I think it is something about identification. You know, that Brubaker article, the first workshop we had for what became the Checkel-Katzenstein book, one of the contributors is actually still in the book, got us going about how can we even be doing this book when we don't know what identity is. And we said, Adrian, it was Favel, you're not allowed to talk about that. And we banned all identity talk, that sort of conceptual type for the rest of the project. And I think it paid off in that we didn't spend 2/3 of the project debating, you know, is it a useful concept for social scientists and the like, and then instead sort of got on sort of what's really happening in terms of the identity terrain in contemporary Europe. So I guess I'm trying to answer your question by saying I wasn't quite sure what you meant by normally. Like, as a social scientist, should we even sort of have this term identity? Actually, yeah, that's useful for me. I mean, so I guess I disagree a bit with the Brubaker or whatever piece. I mean, the thing just to be aware of is social scientists conceptualize identity in different ways depending on their disciplinary starting point. I mean, social psychologists think of it in different ways than anthropologists, right? And just be aware of that. The final step I would add is exploit those different perspectives in trying to, here's my plea for integral, more pluralistic perspectives, and trying to bring them together to get away from the limitations of a sort of a purely one disciplinary-based perspective on identity. I mean, when I look back at what I did, I kicked myself for just not even thinkingly buying into a social psychological conception of identity. No offense to social psychologists here, right? I really love that stuff, okay? But I mean, and I mean that, I do it, but it's something I didn't even think, because I didn't know the other ways to think about identity, the anthropological, whatever, the sociological. And it led me to make arguments about how identities are shaped in Europe that were incomplete. Concrete example, okay? I made all these arguments about persuasion, individual, changing sort of the cognitive beliefs of particular individuals. Yes, that happens, right? Under certain conditions, it does happen, right? But individuals are embedded, here comes a broader disciplinary perspective, in a broader social discourse. And that this social discourse can affect how influential my message is to them, right? But I was ignorant of this other way of thinking about identity, which was partly from a different discipline, from a different epistemological perspective, going back to Michael, right? Another Michael? Michael argument. So yeah, I mean, I'm sort of dancing around this, but I mean, identity is an important concept. We should not get rid of it. But we need to be aware how different disciplines think about it, theorize it, and the methodologies they use to study it, the limitations of each discipline's perspectives, and then potentially what we may gain from combining some of these different perspectives, which in another way is kind of what we were trying to do in the Katzenstein-Checkel book. And nobody's asked it yet, but I'll ask it now, sort of, what's the fundamental flaw of this book? It does not answer the question I put out to you guys. How do you actually do this? This integral, plural in a theoretical, epistemological sense, social science research. We say I have some nice stuff at the beginning, we're setting a new agenda, or sort of opening new doors. Who's going to come and do it? You guys. Are you? I don't know. I mean, maybe. But, you're in a 4 or 5 year PhD program, 3 years, depending on the country, I don't know, right? And the funding. How do you actually learn all this stuff? How do you become competent in different theories and methods, right? It's a non-trivial issue, and we do not answer it in that book. We just kick the can down the road, to use the popular term from American political discourse right now, right? Just somebody else to deal with, right? You guys. Have fun. I have an answer, okay, just quickly, because we do have an interdisciplinary program at Simon Fraser, so I have to talk to students about this all the time. You can never, well, as somebody getting a PhD, I think it's truly extraordinary to expect you to be truly interdisciplinary. I don't know how you do that. How many interdisciplinary PhDs are there? Do you have them in Europe? We don't have them in the US or Canada. I mean, you're typically trained, for a lot of understandable reasons, in one discipline, okay? So, there's kind of at least two ways to implement, operationalize interdisciplinarity. One way, when you're at an earlier point in your career, and there may be professional incentives, resource constraints, time constraints that mean you really have to put your focus in one discipline and getting that right and sort of making your arguments clear there. You can have that discipline as your home, but you can be knowledgeable enough to make use of the theories and methods of at least one other discipline. Now, again, there's still some tricky issues there, knowledgeable enough, what that means, okay, but you can do that as young scholars, I think. Okay, well, that's what I encourage our students at Simon Fraser how to think about it. You've got to base a core in one discipline, but you're not just sort of open to insights from another discipline. You spend some time learning about it, its theories and its methods, and you can actually use them empirically. Okay? That's how you kind of, at an early sort of scholar phase, I would sort of argue how you can sort of answer the question we don't answer in Checkel Katzenstein book. As you get older, older, that's not what I mean, actually. Well, how did Katzenstein and I do it? How did we escape our political science trap? Right? Sorry for all you political scientists, right? I love political science. I was telling those two political scientists at the back, it's great, it's cool. All for political science. But, how did Katzenstein, when he and I, so Cambridge approached us, Katzenstein and me, and they said, do you want to do this? And we said, no. They kept asking us. If you read the preface to the book, it actually says that. It says, Cambridge came to us. We said, why bother? Been there, done that. What else is there to say? But that was precisely it. Precisely the point. We had been there, done that as political scientists, and what else was there to say? So we thought, what could we say that was new? And we actually, I'm not making this up. We said, we're the only two political scientists in this project. Okay? So you do a collaborative endeavor, right, which is not so easy as younger scholars because you got to make your name and you got to have your single-authored pieces, right? But as you get older, you've got a reputation established, you have a permanent job, permanent job, whatever. You can do a collaboration, which is what we did, right, for the Katzenstein-Checkel book. We very consciously recruited all these other disciplines but political science to help us with that interdisciplinarity that we were, because of our own backgrounds, didn't have. Okay? You can co-author things. Okay? But again, this is sort of what comes maybe to sort of slightly later point in your career because collaborations, co-authoring, depends on the national system in terms of how things are counted, right, for publications and whatnot. Those are often viewed as sort of not as good as sort of, a single-authored article or non-edited stuff, write your own book. So that's kind of a second way to implement interdisciplinarity. Consciously try to build research teams, right, that bring that stuff together. And again, it's kind of an obvious thing to say. I'm sure probably many of you some of you are part of those kinds of endeavors already. But for Katzenstein and I, it was really quite eye-opening what we learned from having this group of people together for several intensive workshops. And I mean, it's reflected in what we wrote there. I mean, we now make arguments about European identity that the talk I gave today would have been dramatically different before this book. Okay, it would have a talk about identity, but largely anchored in political science and constructivism. That's not really the talk I presented today. So, you know, I personally, what I've learned is I know a lot more about the world in very positive ways by trying to implement interdisciplinarity in this collaborative sense for about the past decade. The stuff I'm doing on Civil War now, I'm kind of doing the same thing with a couple different projects. Sort of getting a lot of people who aren't political scientists who study Civil War, social psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists. We're all studying the same thing, but we talk about it in different ways because we have different theories and methods. And I'm just discovering, just like the stuff on European identity, I'm learning a lot that I didn't know by staying in my disciplinary comfort zone. And, you know, that's easy to stay in, right? Because there's lots of professional incentives that encourage you to stay in it. And most of us, or speaking for myself, that's kind of where it's easiest to do. You're comfortable there, right? You know the sort of the jargon, the literatures and whatnot. But trust me, I can tell you from having tried to do it for a decade now, it's quite exciting to put yourself outside the comfort zone. Sometimes you get whacked from all sides, but that's actually kind of useful. So sorry, I just wanted to kind of actually really answer that question because it is a very important practical point about sort of how you actually do this interdisciplinarity. So those are the two ways I would argue it can be done. We're in overtime. I guess I should probably stop then. Right, we're supposed to end at 4. I'm just looking. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. I mean, if there's any other questions, just come up and bug me now. I can hang around, drink my water. You can watch me do something besides fondle the bottle. Okay, well, thank you. Those are very good questions, and thank you for listening, and good luck. Carry on. Take identity by storm. Take Jena by storm, whatever. Yeah, okay, thank you.